All right. Hello, beautiful ones, wondrous ones, wherever you are. Coming to you from golden hour time here in Costa Rica, in what I'm calling my Druid Den here in Malpais near Santa Teresa. And I'm happy to have you here with me today as I just riff and wax poetic the next 30 minutes or so on sacred sexuality. And seeing some of you join now, wonderful to see you. And feel free to, at any point, you can ask any questions or make any points or comments, of course, in the comment box. And we're just going to dive in. So I'm gonna start by reading some ancient wisdom on the matter. If you know me, hey James, nice to have you here. If you know me, you know I consider myself an old soul. Maybe I am a bit of a softie for the ancient wisdom, but it's definitely been one of the big revelations of my life that the ancients had a lot to share with us. And I actually feel that in a lot of my research that although they try and, we're kind of told that we're always evolving, we're always on this like forward path of progress, but I'd like to think actually that in some ways we've regressed. There hasn't always been progress. And, one notable instance of that is the burning of the Library of Alexandria by the Romans, which to this day is the biggest library that's ever existed on earth. So you can imagine the amount of knowledge and wisdom that was in that library. And it was burned to the ground just for the sheer kind of toxic patriarchal version of conquest. And so when it comes to a lot of things in sacred sexuality and a lot of things I'm interested in, religion, spirituality, philosophy, I'm always trying to root myself in the ancient wisdom to just honor the ancestors and to also try and salvage and restore some of the wisdom that we may have been severed from. So I'm going to start by reading an ancient Greek tidbit of wisdom on sacred sexuality by a philosopher called Euripides. And he was alive 480 to 406 BC. So this is wisdom over 2,000 years ago. And just to give you that idea. And this is what Euripides said. He said, "Those people are happy who relish love's pleasure, enjoying Aphrodite's sensual embrace as a ship riding easy on a calm sea, avoiding the obsession that leads to disgrace. For sex, like a horsefly, can madden with its sting, and Euros, Cupid, has 2 arrows to his string. A mere scratch from the first brings lifelong joy, but the second wounds to death and breeds despair. Goddess born in Cyprus, Aphrodite, keep my bedroom safe from the mortal arrow. Make love in my life a steady, continuing delight, not obsessional or destructive. Let me serve the great queen with ecstasy, as is her right, but commit no crimes for her, nor become her slave." Whew, that is some potent wisdom from Euripides, ancient Greek philosopher, over 2,000 years old. And I read that to just sort of render the ancient truths on the matter of sacred sexuality. And he really, renders this notion that there is kind of 2 ways about it. We can choose this form of sex, which I would assume he's talking about more of the lustful, passion-driven sex, as we'll get into in this primer, which can lead to a lot of disorder within our body, this kind of despair, even a sense of death. There's some Taoist teachings on this that the orgasm, especially for men, they considered it the little death of the inner Buddha. So when you start to understand this, you see that the ancients had some sort of hidden knowledge. And a lot of us, I consider it hidden because a lot of us have been educated in our Western school systems with hardly any of this sort of education. In fact, most of the education that we've received around sexuality has been so scarce that I would even consider it a form of abuse. because then you're thrust into the world. And when I look back on my teenage years and how I wielded my sexual energy, oh my gosh, it's it sends shivers to just think of the ways that I misused it, the ways that I interacted and hurt others, other women, other women I was dating when I was just totally callow, had no idea what I was doing. And that's not to shame myself or any of us, and shame is something that we have to really nimbly carry whenever we're talking about sexuality, because although there's so much ancient wisdom on the matter, one of the things that I've also realized in my studies of sacred sexuality, it is one of the most ancient wounds that's been kind of passed down through generation to generations through generational trauma. And as one beautiful man, his name escapes me at the time, but I use one of his books when I teach men's work on the archetypes. He talks about how shame is very different than other negative emotions like guilt and sadness, because you can really locate those into the body. For instance, sadness and grief lives in the lungs. But shame is something that he says is global. It's all over the body. It moves. It's very hard to pin down. And so when we're dealing with this kind of ancient wound of sexual shame, it can be really intense. So, that's almost like a disclaimer whenever we're talking about sex. We want to do it in a very tender and compassionate way because it can bring up a lot. But just to sort of contextualize this from the get-go, that from an early age, when we were teenagers and we were first educated about sexuality from the school system, we were not given nearly enough information to know how to have healthy sex. And then beyond sex, sex is the congress of partnership, right? We were not taught about courtship, about romance. We're sort of left to our own devices. And of course, our own devices when we're teenagers, when we're completely manipulated by popular cultures, we start to be inundated by pop stars and pop culture. And of course, when you look at the sexuality that is being programmed to us from that end, it's even more disastrous. It's all about lust and fulfilling this very kind of lustful desire to conquest one another. And then, left to their own devices, a lot of people will then slip into things like pornography. And of course, pornography details, at least most of the hardcore porn, if we're talking about it in a very specific way, is not about a loving intimacy between two people. These are usually two paid actors. There's a lot of drug use in porn. I remember the first time that I saw hardcore porn, I felt sick to my stomach. And it was very confusing at the time because I was in a room with a bunch of my young teenage friends, all of us boys. And I assumed that they were all kind of into this and there was something wrong with me because I was kind of having this visceral kind of disgust. And it wasn't until years and years later that I started studying sacred sexuality and started to realize about my own empathic abilities. And I think we're all empaths to a certain degree and we're all being primed to be sensitive on an energetic level. I started to realize that perhaps my disgust at that scenario was more because I've always been a very romantic, loving person, and that form of sexuality was just kind of like, ooh, that's not what I want to be connected to in some way. Unfortunately, that's what we're besieged by, and that's what a lot of the sexuality, the first images and videos of what sexuality looks like, that's what we receive. So we start at this kind of deficit. And what happened to me in my life was that it wasn't until my 20s, after I'd gone through a period of absolute sexual malaise at university, when I was told through all these dumbass movies like American Pie and such that university's the time when you're just supposed to be like having all this sex and like sowing your wild oats and just making a count of lovers. It was just supposed to be some kind of like way to achieve merit in this weird world. And I actually found myself completely depressed and very languid in terms of sex. And I think I went through years of just not having sex, and I was really lost in pornography at that time and sexual fantasies that I didn't know how to integrate and that made me feel ashamed, didn't feel like conventional compared to what the social mores were sort of being programmed into me or being displayed. So I was in an absolute malaise when I came out of university, and the only saving grace in my life at that time was that I had had an amazing time studying Media and Information Technoculture University, which planted the seed for me having a spiritual awakening in my late months of being 22 years old. And I became absolutely obsessed with spirituality after that. And as it goes in life, whatever you are repressing, especially sexual energy, which is the most potent energy in your body, because we're energetic beings, we're in an energetic reality, that will usually start to imprint, and start to devise circumstances in your destiny that will bring you insight so that you can start to work on these issues in your life. It's such a beautiful thing. What the Tao is called the guiding realm of reality. And so it was no coincidence that I started to find myself studying different forms of sacred sexuality, first through the Gnostic teachings of Samuel Var, the late Colombian Gnostic master. And then I eventually lived overseas in China for a number of years being an English teacher, and that's where I had my first actual, physical spiritual teacher, who was this older Scottish man who was a tantrika in his own right. He had spent 10 years studying Tantra in India, and he was the first one to start to introduce to me some of the books that became the first kind of cornerstones of me delving into sacred sexuality. And from there, it's just been this incredible unfolding journey. Because with sacred sexuality, there's no, and I posted this today, there's no one size fits all. It's just like spirituality. There's so many traditions, so many techniques, so many methods. And that's part of the joy of our age that we live in. You get to jump into and explore all these different ideas. So just to reiterate, we're here, we're talking about sacred sexuality. If you've just jumped on, and if you have any comments or questions, just throw them in there. I'm just going to flow for about 30 minutes here talking about this very important topic. And, there's a reason that a lot of people are talking about this topic. And, I've seen it in my own life, just the amount of sacred sexuality, tantric teachings, that workshops, retreats, they seem to be just blossoming all over the place nowadays. And I think there's an inherent reason for that. I think people are starting to realize that we've been kind of duped and manipulated around sex for a very long time. A lot of us have been told that things like the 1960s was the age of sexual liberation, and while there was an incredible kind of wild Dionysian energy, to borrow from Greek mythology, of the 1960s, I don't necessarily think, and a lot of people in this kind of realm of sacred sexuality share this opinion, this perspective, I don't think it actually liberated us. It maybe allowed us to have a moment of liberation, especially from the very strict social mores of the 1950s. But if you look at the state of sexuality in our modern era, and there's some really devastating statistics, especially with the rise of digital platforms and pornography, younger and younger, especially boys, are getting more and more just connected to porn from a younger and younger age. And we're also starting to realize the science around sex and how sex has a profound effect on things like the endocrine system, which is basically your inner pharmacopoeia. It makes these neurochemicals called hormones that are deeply affecting and pressing on the body, the mind, psyche, the soul of all of us. And it also has a huge effect on brain chemistry, especially what's known as the reward circuit, or the dopamine in the limbic brain, the dopamine cycle, which rules over our pleasure, our sense of pleasure and getting satisfied and satiated. Also rules over our desire or our craving for pleasure, which kind of leads into the downward spiral that can happen when people are using sex as a means to perpetually satisfy themselves and not realizing that there's a taxation that's happening each time. It's like you're using your credit card. There's a debt that can actually occur if you're using sex in a way that isn't circulating the energy back and generating this stronger capacity to hold more energy, which is what sacred sexuality is really all about. How do we transform the sexual experience so that isn't just this really fast, lustful experience of incredible but can be kind of crazed passion, which can leave the body feeling a bit in disarray for days. And rather, how can we have a form of sex that can last a lot longer, where the energies can actually be circulated throughout the whole body instead of it just being a fixation on genital pleasure and a fixation on orgasm as an end? And how can we use sex, and this is maybe one of the most important topics of interest, how can we use sex as a form of what's known as bonding behavior to strengthen our relationships? Because if you look at the state of relationships in our modern world, there is an astronomically high divorce rate. We seem to not know how to stay in relationships long term. and there's a way that we can actually learn to use sex to actually feed the longevity of our relationships too, which I find really, really, really profound. So those are just a few little tidbits. And, again, I just want to reiterate, if some of this information is new to you, that's amazing. And, we really need to have re-education on so many things in our world, especially, I think it was Einstein who actually said, I think so eloquently, that most education starts the moment we finish school. I know that was definitely the case for myself. But with sacred sexuality, it is really, in my opinion, like one of the best ways to re-educate ourselves about how to use sex in a very simple and profound way. So, just to take it into the practical for a moment. So, if you observe, your experiences of sex, and I had this very interesting conversation with my friend Alana the other day, and we were talking about, this form of very passionate, more what I would call conventional sex that most of us are used to. It's usually a very quick experience. It's more animalistic. It's very fast, frenetic energy, and there's the goal of the orgasm at the end. And it's usually the male orgasm, which is kind of the end point, because usually men have a hard time performing after their orgasm is done, whereas with women it can be the opposite. It can actually open them to even more capacity for sex. And then we were talking about in sacred sexuality, which again, as I'm saying, it's this kind of broad stroke, but there's many forms and traditions of it. But one thing that I see in a very common way is a sacred sexual experience is about having a more kind of controlled, and I know that word can be triggering, but a more controlled, a more tender, slower, mindful experience of sex. Mindful experience of sex, where we're using such things as the conscious breath, deeply breathing into the body, and we're using even some energetic sensibility to learn how to breathe energy up and circulate it from the genitals, which are kind of like the generator. It's like the volume dial of the body, how we can circulate that around the body. And so you have these two forms of sexuality, and she was actually sharing, which I thought was really interesting, she was sharing that sometimes after she had had sex in that very passionate way, even though it was very satisfying on one level, her nervous system felt completely like discombobulated, sometimes for days. And I was really grateful for her honesty on that. And I think if we are honest about our sexual experiences, and if we're more observant of how we feel before and after, we might start to apprehend these subtle changes that are happening in the body. And I believe it was the tantric teacher George Feuerstein. Let me just see, I have some of my notes up here. Big note taker. George Feuerstein said, it's not semen loss that's a problem, talking about men. It's actually the firing of the nervous system during sexual stimulation. And that applies to both men and women, he says. So this can be a bit of a triggering moment, because I know in some of the conversations in the workshops I've taught over the years, there has been this kind of almost a protesting energy from a lot of women that I don't want to give up my orgasm. Like, it feels like we've just gotten to the point where women's sexual pleasure is being actually honored. But the facts lay themselves bare. If you look into the science around sacred sexuality, when you have this very frenetic, fast-paced sexual experience, and then you have this orgasm, which is this very explosive energy in the body, they've now scienced this to really show that the orgasm causes a huge explosion of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine rules over your sense of being satisfied, your sense of pleasure. And it also rules over that sense of the craving for that desire. It's very powerful in the sense of the science of motivation, in fact. But they found that when you have an orgasm, this is for both male and female brains, the dopamine explodes in the brain, and that's kind of why you feel this like super blissful feeling. But it's so much dopamine that your body actually goes into deficit afterwards. It cannot reproduce enough dopamine to bring you back to equilibrium. And in some cases, on average, it's about 2 weeks. Yes, that's right. 2 weeks for you to come back into dopamine equilibrium. Now, if you're in dopamine deficiency, there's some very curious symptoms that start to show up. Probably the biggest thing that shows up is you start to have this kind of burning craving all of a sudden to be satisfied by something, because your dopamine's just sort of like yearning and longing because it's in this weak moment, and it's like, oh, I need that fulfillment even more now. Because when you have enough dopamine running through your system, it's kind of this like quieter kind of sense of yearning for desires. It's more balanced, and you have more ability to willfully say no to some of those cravings that may not be serving you. Like, maybe I do not need that second cup of coffee today because I know it's going to throw my nervous system out. However, when you're in dopamine deficiency, there's a bit more of a chaotic cry to your dopamine receptors. They're really like crying out, lamenting even. And so it can be very hard to overpower and control. And then there's this kind of twisted sting to this, in the sense that one of the only things that will bounce your dopamine back up, and in a very temporary level, back up to equilibrium, is novelty, something new. So this can explain this kind of grass is always greener situation, and why it can be strange for lovers, after having a beautiful night of lovemaking that's very passionate, both lovers have orgasms, the next day they may suddenly, irrationally start to like notice other mates around and suddenly feel this strong attraction. Then they'll start questioning, wait, am I really into this person I'm having this beautiful relationship with? And they start to rationalize it in their brains. But what we're missing out is this is not something to be rationalized. This is something that is happening in your body because your dopamine is in deficiency. And what partners should rather do in those moments is start to build up the other hormone, the love, the cuddle hormone, oxytocin, which is built by cuddling, slower lovemaking without orgasm. In fact, is one of the best ways to charge this oxytocin in the body. And oxytocin is this kind of miracle hormone that they're continuing to discover more and more majestic things about. It starts to curb addictions. It really soothes the nervous system. It's one of the best ways to regulate the nervous system, in fact. So this is kind of the science behind sacred sexuality. And when I started to learn this stuff, it was very eye-opening because I had not been taught any of this. And if it wasn't for some of these teachers that I met, who knows how long in my life I would have gone on just kind of wasting my vital energy. Because for men, there's even more of a loss with orgasm because they're actually losing ejaculate, which in Chinese medicine is connoted to the Jing. So that's something why men especially have to be very on their semen retention and using sex in a wiser way. With women, they're more supported by nature. The menses cycle, their ova represents their Jing or their essence in Chinese medicine. That's timed once a month, so they're at an advantage. So it's very interesting to learn all these different anatomical ideas as well from more of these metaphysical medical traditions, such as Chinese medicine and Ayurveda. Just going to pause for a moment. I'm not going to talk for too much longer, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has anything to share in the comment section. And I also want to I'll just pause to take a moment to share that if you want to dive even deeper into all of this really important, I think very important terrain, I would go out on a limb to say actually the sacred sexual paradigm is one of the cornerstones of this kind of shift that we're making that's been prophesized by ancient wisdom, this leap in human consciousness. Some of my indigenous teachers would call it stepping into the new earth. I believe wielding the sexual energy in a much more healthy and conscious way is one of the most potent ways that we can start to build this new civilization based on enlightenment, based on a much deeper power of human consciousness coming into alignment with the sacred. It really is that important. And if you want to dive deeper, in just under 2 weeks, I'm going to be leading this 4-week course called Sacred Sexual Bliss. It will entail classes, online classes for 4 Sundays in a row. All of these classes will be recorded, so if you can't make it at the call times, I believe the call times are about midday on those Sundays. They will be uploaded to a Google Drive and you can access them. And I'm also going to be sharing practices that you will have as homework each week so that you can take the teachings into an embodied sensibility. And we're going to be covering a bunch of different sacred sexuality traditions, such as Carezza. We'll get into a bit around tantric sexuality. And in the last module, we're going to look into the whole idea of conscious partnership, which is really exciting. Like, how can you really bring this all together and put in the context of creating a deep and generating form of love in your life? Because that is really one of the most essential things that we're also wanting to build in our lives. As Carl Jung said, the true path of human destiny is to become more individuated, which is to become more uniquely who we are. And ironically, paradoxically, he said one of the truest ways to do that is through loving partnership and relationship. Because there is this sort of shortcut that happens when you're working with someone constructively in intimacy, and they're giving you that feedback and you have that communication and you're each other's cheerleaders. That kind of partnership can be an engine that can take your evolution into a much more exponential rise. So that course is going to be starting April 30th, and it's going to run for, is it April 30th? Let me just check. I'm running so many things right now, doing live events as well in Costa Rica. So I've got to, and putting together my tour back in Canada and Europe, which is going to be really, really exciting too. Yes, Sunday, April 30th, May 7th, May 14th, and May 21st at 11 a.m. till 12:30 EST will be the classes. And then I'll be giving practices for people to take away with them. And also just to tell you, because some people have already reached out who are interested in taking this course I'll be teaching, this is also for couples and people who are singles. So I'm trying to be very multi-dynamic in this. Rainbow Warrior Phoenix asks, I've never made love. I've only ever been sexually abused and taken advantage of. How do you find love when no one wants you? Been trying to love myself for a while. Well, the path of self-love is truly a hard journey, especially when you've gone through abuse. I haven't gone through sexual abuse, but I went through abuse in my childhood, so I know what that's about. If there's one thing I can recommend, though, it's definitely finding a really good conscious therapist to work through things, or even like a coach who's probably well-trained in some form of psychotherapy. Those can be true and amazing allies to really support you, especially if you're working with sexual abuse, which can be a really, really tough nut to crack. But at the same time, as Robert Bly said, this great writer, he said, our wounds are where our genius lies. And I've gone through a lot of, not sexual abuse, but I went through a lot of sexual repression, to the point where I went through a lot of suicidal ideation in my 20s. And it really wasn't until I started to look at this dilemma, which I saw as kind of a curse, as actually a blessing in disguise, that I started to really turn things around and start to work with this thing. But that would be my main advice, would be to seek a therapist, if you haven't already, to take you on a supported kind of constructive journey of integration. So feel free if you have any questions or comments. So that course is for couples and singles, and it'll be launching on April 30th. This is a course that I've taught live before, and this will be the first time it's going to happen online. Okay, amazing, Rainbow Warrior Phoenix. Good. Well, I'm glad you've been in therapy. It's definitely a long journey. And if you want to be further primed, I have just released my first book as well, Love's Revolution, which is a really beautiful deep dive into the sacred sexuality paradigm. So if I can leave you with like one practical sort of tool to take into your life to bring you into an experience of sacred sexuality, there is this beautiful adage that I follow, and let me just find it to make sure I can paraphrase, but I'd like to honor the great Osho, the great infamous Osho, I should say. He's a very controversial teacher, but also has some beautiful wisdom. And he has this beautiful book on so many topics, and he has this book on Tantra. And this quote, to me, really encapsulates a lot of what sexuality is about, and why sacred sexuality is very simple in concept, and it can actually be very simple in experience too. If there's one thing I try and really point out when I teach this stuff, when I guide this stuff, is that it doesn't have to be something very esoteric. I think a lot of people, even myself included, when I started to study sacred sexuality and Tantra, I think I had this conception in my mind that was kind of intimidating for me. Thank you, Rainbow Warrior Phoenix. That this was something very esoteric. It was going to take years and years and years of mastery. I would say it does take years and years of refinement. It is this beautiful evolving journey because there is always so much more to learn, especially if you're in a partnership. You're going to be churning this evolutionary wheel together. But what Osho says here, which I think is like kind of one of my main mantras around this topic, is Tantra is the transformation of sex into love through awareness. I'll read that again. Just let that sink in. Tantra is the transformation of sex into love through awareness. So if there's one practical thing that I can leave you with, and thank you, Lisa, I'd love to have you in the course, is it's all about awareness. And this can be where it can get tricky. Because when we have sex, especially if we're very early on in a relationship, there will be inevitable triggers that come up. Just being naked in body is being naked in soul in a certain way. And that level of intimacy can be very scary and it can cause a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of performance anxiety, particularly that men deal with, which is a very important topic that a lot of women and men don't discuss enough about. But when we allow ourselves to first have the intention that every act of sex that we're going to have in our life is truly about making love. I mean, remember, sex is called making love for a reason, and I think we take these things too lightly. But when you really focus on that when I have sex with this person, it's going to be an act of love. If you can both start with that, even with a little prayer and meditation, that alone will shift the awareness of the act. But really what it is about is bringing that awareness that you would bring in your practice if you practice yoga or even meditation, which to me our practices are we're just amplifying our awareness of the present moment, which is amplifying our senses of things, our sensuality. And yes, I am going to save this live, I'll be sharing it. If you amplify your awareness of your body, you will inevitably start to feel more pleasure. If you amplify the awareness of your body in sex, you're going to start to feel more pleasure. That is, especially if you're having slow communicative sex, because sex can be painful as well. If you're moving too fast, if the woman is not prepared, if her vagina, if her yoni is not lubricated enough, it can be painful. But I'm talking about in the midst of the throes where everything is harmonized and you're having a pleasurable sexual experience. If you bring awareness into that experience and you amplify your awareness, meaning deep breathing is one of the most practical ways. Treat it as if you're meditating in a moment. Things will naturally start to slow down and you will start to feel more. You will start to feel more because the more present you are to the body, the more your sensuality will respond with a heightened state of your sensors. And this is where the pleasure of sex can start to become more and more and more potent, to the point where it feels so friggin' beautiful. And I'll never forget my first sacred sexual experience, because this was the case. I was just so disciplined in being in my breath and also being at the same time interlocked with this other person. So it starts to get into this like skillful yoga. In that moment, I started to realize that the pleasure that I was feeling in my genitals, the more I just focused on that pleasure, on just like really having that as we call in yoga, drushti, which is where you gaze your eyes when you hold the asana. When I really like focused in on that pleasure, it started to get bigger. And the more I start to breathe, the deeper breathing circulates the chi, the prana, the energy in your body. So the energy started to flow more and more and more. And what ended up happening was the real challenge wasn't, how can I stay focused on the awareness? The real challenge was the pleasure started to feel so damn good that I had to just keep breathing deeper, opening my body energetically deeper. I had to allow myself to make a lot of sound, which at the time I was a little constrained around. And even more so, those sounds suddenly wanted to be very high-pitched, which someone might deem more feminine For a man, that might be like, oh, what am I doing? I'm making these feminine sounds. But that was just my body responding and wanting to express this heightened pleasure more and more and more. And it did reach a point, I remember viscerally feeling this point where I felt waves of love. And not just for the partner I was making love to. I felt love for the room I was in. I remember looking around and just feeling this tangible love for everything. It was like my heart just got activated and it was just shining rays of love everywhere. It was truly a feeling of being in a state of bliss, which is the name of the course that I'm teaching, Sacred Sexual Bliss. And this feeling of bliss, it comes actually more so from the yoga tradition. This bliss is kind of joy that's touched by a sense of divinity. And it is this kind of feeling that when we're in the feeling of sex, we can start to feel this kind of sense of divinity. And I want to find this other quote here from the Karetsa tradition, which is something that we'll be getting into in the course as well. And Karetsa is this beautiful tradition of sacred sexuality. It's probably the one that I hold to the most. And it arose in the 1800s through a woman called Alice B. Stockholm, who was the first female doctor in America, at least as far as I can tell. And she was actually trying to find a way to bring forth natural birth control at the time, because women at the time were giving birth to so many children that they never had any time for themselves. And so she was really trying to reach out and help women, initially. But then she discovered that it all revolved around the man not ejaculating, which then also revolved around the woman not going for orgasm. And then this whole new concept of sexuality started to develop called carezza, which is Italian for caress. And Alice B. Stockholm beautifully describes it as carezza as being finding the King of Heaven in your own hearts. Finding the King of Heaven in your own hearts. And truly, when you start to work with these simple techniques of sacred sexuality, this bliss, this joy anointed by the divine, sex starts to become a portal to the mystical, to the mystic. And that's when it starts to become something so beautiful. And the goddess Venus seems to all of a sudden rule over your life, the goddess of beauty. And your life takes on this very aesthetic, beautiful quality. And I truly believe this is one of the things that can save the world, because when you have access to a constant experience of divine beauty in your life, of that prema, as they say in Sanskrit, that perfect love, that perfect beauty, it's one of the most powerful resources, because it is truly a medicine of the soul, it's a medicine of the mind, it's a mood medicine. It's not this sex that is lustful, that is actually disturbing the nervous system. It's actually reconstituting you, harmonizing your endocrine glands. It sounds almost too good to be true. And that's why I'm teaching this course, because I want you to experience it. Because when you experience it, you start to realize it's not difficult at all. It's actually the natural way that sex wants to be expressed. It's just we have not been programmed. We've actually been educated to go about sex in a very lustful way through the poor education that we got at the school system, through the lustful lasciviousness of pop culture, and then of course through pornography, which is so rife in our culture. Those were our teachers around sex. Who received a sacred sexuality class when they were teenagers? Maybe a rare lucky one, a lucky unicorn. Most of us come to sacred sexuality and tantra after years and years of wounding and confusion. And it's beautiful when you find it. For me, it was like finding the Holy Grail. It was an elixir that continues to absolutely transform my life. So I'm just going to be on here for a few more minutes. So if you have any questions or comments, please fire away. This live it will be replayed and recorded on my feed. So if you're just coming in here at the end, I've been riffing on sacred sexuality for about 40 minutes and talking about the course Sacred Sexual Bliss, which I'll be leading in just about 2 weeks. And if you really want to dive in, if you don't have time to take the course or it's not of interest for you, I do highly recommend checking out my book, Love's Revolution, which you can find on Amazon. I just released it just about a month ago. And if you go over to my YouTube channel, I've been also posting videos here on IG. I've been sharing some of the spoken word films and these beautiful little poems. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining me today on this little webinar, just sharing about the sacred sexuality paradigm. So remember, the next time you have sex, be with your breath. Use your breath as a bridge to take you into deeper forms of love. And just intend, and if you're in partnership and you can have these open dialogues, just intend before you have sex, before you even touch each other, even do a meditation where you get into that frequency that this is going to be an act of truly creating and making love. And that alone, just setting that intention, time and time again, every time you have sex, will absolutely change everything. Diane Jetty, glad you're here. You said, just joined and heard so much goodness. Perhaps this kind of lovemaking you speak of will reduce domestic violence. Well, I mean, it can certainly help. I mean, if someone's in a domestic violence situation, I've actually been in a relationship where I was a victim of physical abuse before. It is an intense thing, and I think people need to make sure they're safe and actually exit a lot of those relationships. But in a zoom-out view, Diana, I do believe that a lot of the peace and serenity, the harmony that's come, the mood medicine that sacred sexuality can bring to a person's nervous system, to their body, the healing medicine can actually assuage, can actually heal a lot of that root energy in a domestic abuser that may be causing them to be violent and abusive to another. There's a lot of generational trauma that we're dealing with, but modern life is also very, very hard on our nervous systems. In fact, the late, great Edgar Cayce, the medical medium, who I'm also very inspired by in the sacred sexual realm, he wrote a very amazing, I don't know if it was a book, but it was shared with me via a series of essays. And he said, he prophesied, he passed away I think in the 50s, but he prophesied that in the future, modern life will get so intense on the sheer level of our nervous systems. The amount of radiation, pollution that we're dealing with, just on a baseline level, is so taxing on our nervous systems. And he said we would reawaken to the healing power of sacred sexuality and would provide this sort of universal panacea, this universal medicine that would help to heal and realign our whole species. And I do believe we're at that pivot point right now. So I'm going to leave it there, everyone. And if you're just joining now, this will immediately, I think, be posted, so you can go back and rewatch it. And I just want to thank all of you for being with me for this last 45 minutes. It's been really delightful to speak on this topic. I'll share a link as well to my course, Sacred Sexual Bliss. You can also find it in my link tree in my bio. And the whole page is there with all the details of what that course entails. It's going to be a really powerful 4-week deep dive for singles and couples to just dive into this paradigm. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of embodied practices. You can experience it for yourself, try and test it in your life, and start to live this revolution of love that is being asked for, I believe, as we make this big shift, this huge leap forward into this new earth, to really actualize our species into a whole new stage of evolution and development. I do believe sacred sexuality is one of the key foundations of that. So thanks everyone for joining me. I'm signing off now, and I'll see you next time, wishing you all the blessings of love wherever you are in the world. Namaste.